Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. It's been a little while since my last video, about a couple of months. I've not been very well, I've just really needed a lot of rest and I'm finally back up to making videos. So here's the overdue next episode, which will cover the first releases of what is generally considered the ISDN era. Far Out Son of Lung, Ramblings of a Madman, Smokin Japanese Babe. It having been over a year since Tales of Ephedrina, I'm sure Brian and Garry were getting itchy feet when it came to names, and so it was only a matter of time before they adopted a new moniker. Actually, the use of Far Out Son of Lung was more than simply a new alias for a new sound. It was a promotional game. The white 12-inch, which is broadly believed to be limited to 500 copies, was promoted with the cover story of it being the debut release from a pair of Japanese producers. Despite being stylistically somewhat different to past releases, however, the dense layers of samples and of course the FSOL initialism were hard to see past, and reviewers picked up on it pretty quickly. Nevertheless, the press response was overwhelmingly positive. The content is largely material that later ended up on the ISDN album. The Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman is present with an otherwise unheard intro environment intact, under the truncated name Ramblings of a Madman. Are They Fighting Us appears, with its third word unabbreviated. Smokin Japanese Babe closes the set. Track 2, Z-Box, is the only exclusive, and not exactly ever so well, actually being Ear Out or TV Dinner Part 1, two different names for an 80s track by Brian's solo project Z-Box, with the War on Drugs environment included at the end. The second side pleasingly includes the two tracks that sample the same John Williams bass loop. The artwork is a little unusual. The Japanese characters and text on the A-side are fairly self-explanatory, while the B-side features a warped face with what looks like Japanese advert and an amusingly naff-looking scrawl of the artist name drawn by a computer mouse. Fair play to the band, they definitely managed to disguise the FSOL house style. No credits are present for either music or graphics. I'll discuss the tracks when I get to ISDN and indeed Z-Box. The promotional 12-inch approach to previewing ISDN will continue shortly after with the release of Promo 500 under the name The Future Sound of London. The cover bears no title, but the spine suggests it's called Promo 500. Of course it might be untitled and Promo 500 is the catalogue number. Hey, it's FSOL, there has to be at least some mystery attached to the release. Once again, the 500 refers to the purported number of copies made. The track selection is more interesting than the previous release, with both sides of this era represented. You're Creeping Me Out and Live in New York showing off the electronic, vaguely ambient side, and the remaining three tracks heavily percussive. The most curious aspect is that only two of these tracks, Slider and You're Creeping Me Out, would end up on the ISDN album released shortly afterwards, with Snake Hips following on the album's reissue 6 months later. Heard Killing and Live in New York would remain exclusive to the release until 2007, with the digital EP Teachings from the Electronic Brain Rare Tracks edition. Further confusion, there's always further confusion, would come from Heard Killing's title being recycled for the musically unconnected Dead Cities track in 1996. Although generally unchanged from the album versions, the three ISDN tracks are present in their environment-free forms, the only place they can be heard with silence at each end. The artwork is minimal, all black with white text and the old Virgin Records logo on the cover. FSOL were very keen to use this classic Virgin logo, the one that appeared on the likes of albums by Tangerine Dream in the 70s, and the more famous 90s logo was still yet to appear on an FSOL release at this point. The sides are labelled North, South, East and West rather than the conventional A, B, C and D. The release uses Eurostyle as the main font rather than the more common Eurostyle Extended. Once again, I will cover the ISDN tracks once I get to them, but for the two exclusive tracks, Heard Killing. Never wants to make things simple, Brian and Garry named a track Heard Killing, only to release it on an obscure promo 12-inch and then reuse the name for a musically unrelated track 2 years later. The Promo 500 Heard Killing is a track very much in the ISDN vein, raw, loose and sketchy. Built around a churning, distorted drum beat, looped from a performance on a live drum kit with a strangely jarring, new agey flute and an odd horn instrument. The track cycles through these elements twice before slowing down to end on a deep rumble. It's a bizarre little track, not hard to hear why it never ended up on an album, but an enjoyable curio in its own right. The only known broadcast of this track was to the kitchen in New York. For the longest time, most fans were only able to hear the track via a very bad vinyl rip. It starts too loud and the volume is amusingly adjusted about 20 seconds in. In 2007 it received a long overdue reissue as part of the digital-only EP Teachings from the Electronic Brain Rare Tracks edition. Live in New York. Live in New York is effectively an untitled track, as its name simply comes from the fact that it opened the New York ISDN transmission. It's one of the more ambient-leaning pieces from the ISDN session, opening with bubbling synths that would also be reworked as a diversionary tactic, before moving into an analogue synth section and then incorporating elements of Tired. The mood is pretty dark in an ISDN way. It's an abstract track that, much like Tired itself, feels like a collection of environments as much as a single piece. Although only originally released on Promo 500, it has remained more easily available than many of the band's other rarities, first appearing on the 2001 Astralworks compilation Rare Works, and then being reissued in 2007 on the digital EP Teachings from the Electronic Brain Rare Tracks edition. Now, we don't have release dates for either of those 12 inches, all we know is they appeared in late '94. At this point, the release that fans would have been most expecting was Environment's the second Amorphous Androgynous album. This never came along. The band had already started work on completely new material, and Environment's is largely Lifeform's era. Also, there was an expected single to be released for Eggshell. A catalogue number both for Astralworks and Virgin was given for this, and it was announced by Astralworks as a forthcoming release. However, once again this was scrapped. The band had been working on the Lifeforms era for a couple of years by this point and had already got new ideas and new sounds in mind. And thus, in September '94, we got the first hints of what was to come, with the ISDN transmission to VPRO radio on the 9th of September '94. This was after a couple of months' break, with Brian and Garry returning very quickly to ISDN transmissions in the autumn of '94. Only one of two official dates we have for this period is the broadcast of VPRO Radio Netherlands. Despite this only being broadcast a month after the delayed Lifeform single, it's clear from the off that the band had very much moved on. This is the start of really what we call the ISDN era. The introduction includes a particular beeping sample that was used throughout earlier transmissions and briefly on Room 208, but from then on it's almost entirely new material. The VPRO transmission gives an idea of the change in sound the band had been making during their 1994 recording sessions. ISDN is often talked about as being a more rhythmic album with elements of hip-hop, trip-hop and jazz, and this is very much the case here. 5 tracks from the album itself are credited as being taken from this exact transmission: Just a Fucking Idiot, Slider, You're Creeping Me Out, Egypt and Hot Knives. The latter two aren't actually in the show, but their never so well credit should always be taken with a pinch of salt. See also It's My Mind That Works being listed as from this show and the New York one, depending on whether you're looking at the black or white edition of ISDN.
I had killed a man who looked like me.
An intriguing curio lies between the first 2 tracks on the transmission, which are also the first 2 tracks on ISDN. However, instead of the two playing out in the same manner as the album, there is a brief environment between them, including that previous snippet of dialogue from the movie Deep Cover. It's a rare moment that bridges the gap between the 93-94 era and Dead Cities, and ended up being used as Dead Cities' title track. Dialogue from the movie Aliens introduces the next environment, a mix of crow calls, what sounds like reversed singing, and a spoken sample from a documentary about Indian musicians. Aliens dialogue appears on a couple of tracks on ISDN, and here makes a refreshing change after these same quotes used over the Kiss transmissions and 3D Headspace tour. It's another thing that really makes this feel like a clean break and a new era. There's also dialogue from Lorne Greene as Commander Adama in the original Battlestar Galactica series. You're Creeping Me Out continues the ISDN material, followed by the environment that would close Slider on the album. It's a particularly dark section: church bells tolling, strange crawling noises creeping out of speakers, disembodied voices wailing. As on ISDN, it leads straight into Smokin, Japanese Babe. It's possibly the epitome of the rawer, jazzy feel that this era has, and no doubt anybody listening would by this point realise that Lifeforms is very much in the past. Its extended outro includes a phone conversation that would later turn up on Dead Cities era environment Remains Interrupt. A brief snippet of Tired follows, and then it's back into chunky drums with the wonderfully strange fractional difference, the first of many unreleased tracks on the show, many of which would end up on the From the Archive series years later. While the earlier transmissions focus largely on pieces that would end up being officially released at the time, with only a small number of unreleased tracks broadcast in the 20 plus shows, the late '94 broadcasts are home to a large number of still unknown pieces. This could be partially accredited to Lifeforms being a double album, although it's only actually about 15 minutes longer than ISDN. Either way, it makes for excellent listening. Another new environment, which appears to be a warped, beatless version of You're Creeping Me Out, followed by snoring, comes straight before the well-known Bill Hicks sampling War on Drugs environment. This routine would later go on to give the title to Are They Fighting Us from the album. Then comes one of the highlights of the show, the full 8-minute version of It's My Mind That Works. This track has always been one of my favourites, and it's a shame the album version only uses a 3-minute segment from the middle of the entire piece. The VPRO transmission is the only known place that this version can be heard. There's further Aliens dialogue sample, slider following the final one, as it does on the album itself. After a brief diversion into a very unsettling humming environment, this is really some of the most uncomfortable listening in the FSOL canon, and a surprise return to a couple of 3D Headspace Tour environments. There comes a run of unknown tracks. The first features acid synth, old school breaks, dub bass, a horn sample and what even sounds like scratching. It's a very long way from anything the band would officially release, but continues the pitch black mood from the previous tracks. Even stranger is the one that follows, with new age strings and synths that build into a scuzzy version of the drum machine from Are They Fighting Us, over which guitar feedback wails. The noisy approach continues on the third release track, with distorted drums, a jazz band, the same that will be sampled at the end of An End of Sorts, and more feedback-coated ambience. The next environment even samples the Good Guy Doll advert from Child's Play, adding to the staggeringly dark mood. A diversionary tactic follows in similar form before an extended version of Appendage comes along to lighten the mood, if only briefly. It's not quite the revelation that the full It's My Mind That Works is, but it's nice to have a slightly longer version of this gorgeous ambient piece. Then we get a couple of samples from Escape from New York, another film that would be sampled on ISDN itself. Some tracks stick around longer than others, and Dirty Shadows is one. First heard in '93, it was skipped over for inclusion on Lifeforms, but the band continued to include it in transmissions, and it finally made it to ISDN at the end of the year. It's included here, and followed by the closing environment of a diversionary tactic, both parts of the track debuting in this show, but not being united until the release of Environments 3 16 years later. A 3D Headspace Tour environment follows, including a snippet of Wet Pavement, and then someone talking about overcoming their middle-class prejudices. It's a particularly odd section, and it highlights the one issue I have with this show. There's less of a sense of place, the environment's feeling less atmospheric and more like bizarre sound collages in their own right. These sections certainly don't compare to some of their trippy, vividly visual counterparts broadcast earlier in the year. Then it's back to more Lifeforms era offcuts, with Dirty Shadows' unofficial sister track, The Teeth of the Wind, closing with a Hamlet soliloquy spoken over acoustic guitar strumming. One wonders whether a snippet from Down and Out in Beverly Hills, talking about someone losing interest in sex, was a reference to the supposed listener who was unable to have sex as a result of listening to one of the band's transmissions. It plays out over the hip-hopish Wanting, the first in another run of tracks that would remain unreleased throughout the 90s. Some heavily phased drums with saxophone improvisation that bleeds into a particularly squelchy 303 workout backed by Eastern instrumentation and weird FM synths. It sounds like the pair messing about in the studio rather than a fully formed track, a kind of looseness only really found in this particular transmission, and it definitely adds to the idea that this is a live show. The black and blue and green environment from the previous tour follows, a strange reminder that this is all happening only a few months after Lifeforms was released. Quotes from the film Repo Man, bookend Brujo, which is followed by the final unreleased track from the show, a chuggy hip-hop beat with dubby piano stabs and squelching, growling samples. The piano gives it a certain brightness, largely missing from the rest of the transmission, but the overall feel is very much in keeping with the rawness of the era's overall sound. More ISDN tracks, Are They Fighting Us and Tired, some 3D Headspace Tour era environments, and a final From the Archives track, Unassumed, close the show on a far brighter note, acting as a bit of a pick-me-up after the largely bleak 90 minutes before. As an introduction to the new direction FSOL were taking after Lifeforms, the VPRO show does an exceptional job. Some of the new environments do feel a little less developed than previous ones, especially those with large chunks of film dialogue in them, and the tracks are more heavily rhythmic, making the show less atmospheric and ambient, but in many ways that reflects the era perfectly. The transmission was released as a download on the 1st of February 2010 as part of FSOL Digital's Podroom, the cover design being given a green and pink overlay. Kiss FM transmission 1994. This is a bit of an odd one. There's no date on it at all on any of the bootlegs, although it's clearly 94. There's no reference anywhere online or in the band's literature about the show. Nevertheless, the bootleg appeared online in the early 2000s on the Disenchanted FTP. The quality isn't particularly great, but it's not bad for an MP3 rip of a cassette recording of an FM radio show. At the time, it was a particularly exciting bootleg as it contained 8 unreleased tracks. Most of these would end up on From the Archives and Environment series later. Although there's no date given, the transmission is clearly from the second half of 1994, with next to no crossover with the 3D Headspace Tour track lists, and film sample sources mirroring those from the VPRO broadcast. A bootleg found on Mixcloud suggests that this was simply the VPRO broadcast replayed in the UK. However, there are major differences between the original bootleg, the Mixcloud bootleg, and the official VPRO release. We're just going to have to chalk this one up as a bit of a mystery. The show opens with an environment built around dialogue from Repo Man, treated with the same vibrato effect as the opening of It's My Mind That Works. Included in the paranoid rant is the phrase "Eyes melt, skin explodes, everybody dead," which no doubt led to the slightly paraphrased title of the track that closes the hour. The first piece is the only known transmission appearance of the Liquid Cool remixer, an Apollo 440 track the band reworked in '94. After a brief unreleased environment, this leads into Nearly Home, immediately suggesting a far less dark tone than VPRO. After a brief excerpt of Tired, the brighter melodic mood continues with Distant Memories and She Fell Backwards. Tracks like these are strangely at odds with ISDN itself, and the show is testament to the band's editing skills. They could easily have released an album of tuneful, emotive ambient music at the end of the year, but deliberately chose to omit the bulk of this material from ISDN to make a very different album that contrasted sharply with Lifeforms, rather than releasing one that sounded simply like Lifeforms 2. One of the few brighter pieces from ISDN, An End of Sorts, continues the theme. The first unknown track of the show is built around the opening environment of Tired, and is a heavily percussive piece, surprisingly at odds with the material performed so far. This then leads into an extended version of the melancholic synth section of Tired itself. A fascinating alternate version of Lifeform's Path 4 follows with heavier beats, a squelching 303 bass line, electric guitar samples and a flute melody. Perhaps it's the novelty of only hearing it occasionally, but I generally think it's a better version than the released cut and would love to hear a proper full-length recording of it one day. Afterwards is a rare ISDN appearance of Hot Knives. The Fripp sampling Brujo is a brief intermission from Repo Man samples, with the Everybody's Into Weirdness Right Now section following in full. As with the VPRO transmission, the new environments here seem to be largely dialogue based with fewer layers of sound. The unknown track with dubby piano first heard on VPRO gets a second outing as the final unreleased piece from the broadcast. A brief snippet of Are They Fighting Us is heard just before the 45-minute mark before disappearing. It's very likely the track was lost due to the tape needing to be flipped at this point. The bootleg reconvenes with a version of Nadir with saxophone samples on top. The show closes with 3 tracks getting their only known performances: Egypt, Ice Pop Skin Explodes Everybody Dead, and Desio Reconstruction, the latter appearing many months before the remix album it features on was released. If the May and June 3D Headspace Tour was an experiment in variations on a theme, the late '94 shows showed the band capable of vastly varied transmissions in a short space of time. The VPRO, Kiss FM and New York broadcasts all have incredibly varied moods with wildly different track lists. At this point it isn't clear at all what tone the following album will even take. ISDN, The Kitchen, New York, 5th of November '94.
The band always seems to be playing in another street. Go to where the band is playing. They're mysteriously locked in their rooms.
A sample of Quentin Crisp, given some rather surreal vibrato, opens this transmission to The Kitchen in New York. It is shortly followed by a more famous sample of Could You Leave the Lights Alone Please, Stop Flashing the Fucking Lights. This section appears to be the full opening environment later used in truncated form on Just a Fucking Idiot. Garry, in typical rock star music interview style, has later suggested that this was the band talking in studio as a way to show listeners that they were present, despite the fact that neither of them has a broad Manchester accent. The actual source was apparently a bootleg of Joy Division in the warehouse in Preston 1980, however the most complete recording of that show doesn't include the sample, and Bernard Sumner's mic mix sounds incredibly different. I actually asked Brian where it was from and he confirmed it was neither Joy Division nor New Order, which were the two main suggestions, but it was from a bootleg recorded in Manchester in the early 80s. Could very well be one of Brian's favourite groups from the time. He's known to have recorded shows by the likes of a certain Ratio. It could also be a small local band that's been completely forgotten. Until that bootleg turns up online somewhere, we'll never know. The first full track is, perhaps unsurprisingly, Live in New York, also found on Promo 500. It's a very dark opening, something only emphasised by the unreleased track that follows, a gloomy piece with distorted breaks, a dark acoustic guitar loop, and typically sinister sounding waterphone samples. For quite a while the performance of The Kitchen was believed to be the first proper gig the band performed, widely considered their first ISDN transmission. This was due to the 11th of May date on the cover, but this actually turned out to be a mistake, derived from a reversed 5th of November date. The ISDN liner notes and interviews from the time date the show as being broadcast in November 94, and of course this makes sense, the material all lines up with it. Instead of it being an early preview of ISDN material broadcast around the time of Lifeforms, the show is simply part of the late 94 tour, which featured most of the ISDN material. Much of that album's hip-hop and jazz influence is lacking here, only Slider and The Far Out Son of Lung represent that side of the album, but the majority of ISDN's ambient side is present. Several tracks from the album itself received their debut performance here. The album's liner notes also suggest that Ice Pop's Can Explode Everybody Dead was broadcast, but the piece isn't present outside its opening environment. Of course, finding errors is part of the experience of being an FSOL fan. The Kitchen is an art space in New York that specialises in forward-thinking and experimental performance art. FSOL's new ISDN approach was perfect for the venue, and this setting might also explain why they went for a more immersive ambient sound. Just a Fucking Idiot ends with the environment that seeks straight into The Far Out Son of Lung on the album, suggesting the main album structure was completed at this point. At 18 minutes we get another appearance of the War on Drugs environment, the Bill Hicks stand-up segment slowed down with bells and samples behind it. The appearance of Journey to the Centre from Environments 2 surprised many, myself included, due to the track's vast atmospherics. The archives, environments and pod room releases have revealed that the group recorded in various styles and sounds for every album, only later selecting a particular atmosphere or theme as they pieced the record together. After another unreleased environment, including some reused water and synth sounds from Lifeforms, the first heavily rhythmic track of the transmission finally arrives in the form of Slider. The the way everybody's into weirdness right now conspiracy theory from Repo Man follows in full, rather than the truncated version from the album, and is joined by another unreleased environment, and then the Stephen Jesse Bernstein sampling More Noise Please environment, another transmission favourite, comes in for the final time. After the lo-fi rumble of the Promo 500 version of Herd Killing, things head back into ambient territory once again, with a scattering of ISDN environments and even Lifeforms material, its only appearance in the form of Birdwings, as well as what is likely the oldest piece in the show, known as FSOL Dead Can Dance sound samples first heard in the Kiss FM transmissions. The environment section features the He Knew More About What I Was Going to Do Than I Did Apocalypse Now sample, previously used on Kiss transmissions as well, but here cut up and slowed down in a development of the band's sampling technique, followed by a loop of an Isaac Albéniz piece for guitar and some exclusive digital noise and sampling. Two more ISDN cuts appear in the transmission's closing run, The Far Out Son of Lung and You're Creeping Me Out, while the rest of the broadcast is set aside for further environment and ambience, only broken for the appearance of the unreleased track Opening Closure. The opening minute of the transmission exclusive version of Papua New Guinea also appears. The show appears to be the one discussed in the white ISDN liner notes. Somewhere thousands of miles away, people were gathered to hear us. We knew they needed to feel that we were physically here in Dollis Hills, separated only by an ISDN line. The restless nerves leading up to the start of this inaugural performance are clear in the text. Garry stating that it was 3 in the morning, we were knackered, the last shops had closed hours ago and there was nothing to do. Nevertheless, it's clear from the recording that the show went without a hitch. The New York transmission is one of the essential FSOL ISDN broadcasts, an astonishing show that blends familiar music with unreleased cuts and plays out with enough confidence to make it feel like an album in its own right. The use of environments is much heavier and more developed than the other known late 94 shows, giving it a generally richer feel. The transmission was released as MP3 on the 1st of February 2010 as part of a large Podroom update. As with most of the ISDN transmissions in the pod room, it was given a number, in this case live ISDN transmission 2, although how those numbers work and fit together remains oblique. The cover features the design shared with all pod room ISDN releases, based around what looks like a photo from the same shoot as the Environment 6 artwork with overlaid colours. Now, FSOL's music has often been described as having a soundtrack-like quality, and indeed it can be very visual, very atmospheric, very descriptive in its sounds. However, soundtracking is not something they've ever really done. Indeed, the only soundtrack work they did in the 1990s was to a programme as part of BBC's Weird Night, an evening on BBC 2 in December 94 devoted to things weird and paranormal. The programme was called W.S.H, which stood for Weird Shit Happens, named after a line in the film. It's a wonderfully odd, surreal, trippy kind of programme with conspiracy theories, a lot of other just very, very 1990s sci-fi and horror tropes in it. It's not incredible, but it's surprisingly good for a one-off BBC commission, especially in an era when the BBC was not making programmes like this. The music for the show was created by the Future Sound of London, and they provide a backing score for most of the 50-minute episode. It's mostly previously heard material. A lot of it is environments and elements from the ISDN transmissions, bits that ended up on environments itself, and a lot of the transmission exclusive elements are there. Lots of very familiar sounds rattling under delays and other effects. There are also a couple of environments which aren't featured on any known transmissions, including a really gorgeous one with violin samples and some vocals. That appears a couple of times in the film, and it's a shame that it's never been released. 3 full tracks also appear, the FSOL Dead Can Dance Sound Samples piece, as well as The Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman, and Vertical Pig, which appears over the end credits. The bizarre sounding nature of the group's 1994 material, particularly those on the transmissions and the ISDN era, really lends a suitable tone to the strangeness of the programme itself. At one point there was discussion of releasing the full W.S.H soundtrack on FSOL Digital, although this has never happened. Whether this was due to rights or simply it just got put to the bottom of the pile, it remains unclear. The film has never been officially released, but a copy converted from VHS and uploaded in 2008 does appear on YouTube. If you search for BBC Weird Night W.S.H, it appears in 5 10-minute sections. You may also notice some sections of dialogue that were later sampled by the band in the 2010s. And before I go today, just time for a one-off track, a remix, the only remix the band released in 1994. Apollo 440, a Liquid Cool Future Sound of London remix. When Apollo 440, at the time dealing in vocal-led, post-punk tinged Eurotechno, asked FSOL to remix their melodic epic Liquid Cool theme from Cryonic Suspension, it's likely they're expecting something back that sounded a bit like Cascade or one of the band's 1993 remixes. Indeed, the track is ripe for a vast ethereal remix a la Darshana. Of course, by the time Brian and Garry got to work with it, they'd moved on to the ISDN sound, and the remix followed suit. Their Liquid Cool remix is led by a chunky hip-hop beat and throbbing electric bass. Percussion is laid on in thick slabs, and while elements of the original track's melodies are present, notably the haunting violin sample and brief use of wordless vocals, the one aspect FSOL draw to the fore from the track is Noko's electric guitar. Used as a brief solo in the original, it leads much of the remix, squealing atop the shuddering breakbeats into something that, if anything, predicts the direction Apollo 440 will go themselves by the end of the decade, albeit in a much more interesting manner than the material released on Getting High on Your Own Supply. The CD version of the remix is edited slightly to fit chart rules. Other than removing 8 additional bars near the end, it also cuts an outro environment with running water and synth pads. As good an example of FSOL's continual desire to challenge themselves and those around them, the track is the band's only remix released in '94, which is kind of an odd scenario given the huge success they found that year, notably with more ambient music. I know it will lose me 20 FSOL points to say this, but it's a very rare example of an FSOL remix where I actually prefer the original. The Apollo 440 track is one of their best, at a point before they became a bit of a novelty act, and while I admire the direction Brian and Garry took it in, their remix loses some of the atmosphere and beauty in the process. But hey, that's just me, it's a very popular remix. And that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hopefully will be able to keep up the video schedule again now, so there'll be another one coming very soon. But please do leave me a comment below, let me know your thoughts on these transmissions, this material, anything new you've learned from this video, I'd love to hear it. And there are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might want to press. And next time I will be covering the black release of ISDN. I'll see you then.